Hej och välkomna. The defense today will be held in English, so therefore I switch to English now. My name is Johan Lundin. I'm a professor in informatics at the Department of Applied IT here at the IT faculty. I will act as the chairman for this session. I'm also the examiner of Lena. And for those of you that haven't been to PhD defense before, and maybe as a reminder for those that have, we will start with Lena will be given a chance to provide errata, or if there's any comments that she needs that has to be said before the discussion. And after that, we will turn to the opponent that will present the thesis. And after the presentation, the candidate will be given a chance to comment on this presentation. And then we will go on to a discussion between the candidate and the opponent on the merits of the thesis. After this, there will be given a possibility for the audience to ask questions, starting with the grading committee. And when there's no more questions, the grading committee will meet to grade the thesis. And during this time, there will be drinks and snacks for the audience who wants to wait for the result. And when the grading committee is done, we will know the result of the defense today. So the important persons here today is obviously the candidate, Lena Dafgård, which will defend her thesis. It's the opponent, Stefan Rastinsky, professor at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, as well as guest professor at Mid Sweden University. We have Dina Kutsikori from the Department of Applied IT. We have Suli Vigmo from the Faculty of Education, as well as Anders D. Olofsson, professor from Umeå University. So before I leave the word to Lena, I will ask you to either put your phones on silent or turn them off. And I would also like to say that the defense will also be streamed. So if there's any question that you ask and so on, those will be broadcasted. Maybe it also will be recorded. We don't know. No, we don't know. Yeah. So now I give the word to you, Lena, if there's anything that you would like to say or comment before Stefan starts.
I have found a few typos reading it again these few days, but there is nothing of substantial importance, so I think that I give the word to Stefan instead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great. It's very nice to be here, and it's really nice to see so many people here who are here for the presentation, our discussion, and the other questions. So this thesis, as you can see, I put the title up here, Digital Distance Education, a longitudinal exploration of video technology. And obviously here the context is distance education. But when we think about distance education, it has actually changed a lot with the technical developments through the years. So early on, distance education was typically correspondence courses based on sending letters back and forth, and has been developed, and we'll talk more about that, but been developed to today when we try to take advantage of digital technologies to enable meeting and discussing with each other in an online setting. So during these years, a lot of different technologies have been introduced into distance education, evaluated, and we've tried to make good use of them. And one of these is video, which Lena has looked more into, which is used quite a lot and has been increasingly used over the years. So if we look at the thesis, I've have the chapters here on this slide. So it starts like it usually does with an introduction where Lena introduced the topic, the aim, research questions. And this is followed by a chapter on digital distance education. And here we can learn about the development of distance education over the years, how it's turned into being more and more digital, and one reason for why you call it digital distance education to make that point, but also some central concepts and even some theories are mentioned here that has been used in the research. This is followed by a chapter that more specifically looks into video and video research in sometimes in general, but more specifically in distance higher education. And for example, there are one important contribution there is this bringing together research into a typology of different types of using video. So when we say video, maybe some of you think about a certain use of video, but there are actually many different uses, different ways we can use video in distance education, and we'll talk more about that. But for example, it can also be used by students, for example, and that might not be something that we think of at first. There's also a chapter on a theoretical framing, and here Lena introduced two theoretical perspectives, which is sociocultural learning theory and a theory on affordances as a way of understanding the empirical data. And then as typically we have in a thesis, there's a method chapter, design and methods here, and here Lena introduced the research and more specifically 2 studies that she have conducted. And the first one of these is presented in a chapter, and it's a national survey that you did, trying to look at how video is used on a national level. So we'll talk about that, but actually contacting every course during a certain year and to see distance education course to see how they've used video. But something I think that maybe you reflected on is that the survey give us this broad view, but it's difficult to get this more in-depth understanding, maybe explain your findings. So as we often do in applied IT-related disciplines, you often complement the data with different data collection methods. And for Lena here, it's been an interview study at Karlstad University at a teacher education program that had many distance education courses. And I think one argument to choose that was that in teacher education, we have many different subject disciplines. So even though we interview and try to gain a deeper understanding, we can still get the breadth of different subject disciplines. And then there's concluding discussions, bringing forth the main conclusions, discussing the results and limitations, further research, contributions to practice. All that can be found here. So if we look at the aim of the thesis, here it is, and it's pretty straightforward. So it's to better understand the possibilities and limitations of video in digital distance higher education. And the aim is addressed through looking at what you describe as 3 elements of analysis. So it's the video technology, different distance courses, and distant teachers. So, and that's something important to keep in mind. It's done from a teacher perspective. And we will also look at the research questions. So here is the first research question, which is actually many questions, but it's a question broken down into other questions. So how is digital video used in distance higher education? And then more specifically, when teachers design distance courses with digital video, which categories of video are used or not used? How much are these categories used? Why are they used or not used? And how are they used? The second research question is, how do course designers respond to the possibilities and limitations of video for distance higher education. And then the third research question is, what are the teachers' attitudes and perceptions about the use of digital video in distance higher education? So it's you're aiming to get quite a broad understanding of this, and it's quite an inclusive way of formulating questions, even though you break the questions down into sub-questions and so on. So there is, as you can see, there's many pages in the thesis, but I think I will pick some parts that I think is very important, and one of those is this description of distance education as generations. And I think that is one of the different ways you can describe distance education to really understand how different it is today than what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and we can really trace that development. And that can be described in different ways, but you're using one description here, which in these generations. And it started with correspondence courses that we talked about earlier. And then in the second generation, we can talk about a multimedia model. Here, the broadcasting and even using television emerged, like radio, television. Later on, you could use video, and later on you could use computers for this as well. And this is a model that, even though all these generations are still used in some way. So if you look at, for example, the world's largest universities in the world, Open University in India, for example, are very dependent on using television to deliver education to many students simultaneously. Actually have several TV channels that they used. The third generation, and here we're somewhere around the 70s, here audio conferencing was introduced, which is important in the sense that we could discuss in groups, which was more difficult before. And in this telelearning model, as it's called, in the 90s, it was also possible to do two-way video conferencing, or at least that's the time when it became more common. So we could have students geographically dispersed, often at, for example, learning centers where they were groups of students, and a teacher in another place. And then what has really happened during the last decades with the emergence of the internet is the development of the fourth generation. And here we could talk about a more flexible learning model and delivering distance education in more flexible ways. And those range from simple technologies like text-based technologies where we can send messages, share texts in easy ways, share documents, to being able to do video conference at your computer, at your home. And that's a really important, I think, development in video, and we will come back to that. And I'll also mention this simple but I think important distinction that Moore did in the 90s. He talked about 3 types of interaction. So while distance education has often be quite focused on producing good content and enabling student content interaction, the opportunities for student-teacher interaction has improved over the years, and especially what he would say was new there, and what he encouraged us to experiment with is student-student interaction. So this opportunity to see distance education as not something that you do by yourself, but that you can collaborate with others and get support when you need, and things like that. So also I think it's important really what is video, and this is something you talk about this thesis, and people have different views about what video is, and you use this definition. In this thesis I define video as digital moving pictures and sound, including both video and television, which are used in higher education. So in a sense it's a definition, but you say what kind of video is relevant for me, and that's why you introduce higher education here, I think. And as I mentioned, this is as part of the theoretical background, you bring that together into this model, and this is a nice illustration of different types of video. And what I think is most important here is, all of it is important, but it's the more general categories here where we can talk about recorded video and live video, which is quite some difference there. And so when in recorded video, we have video-based materials, video recording teaching situations. Also, often in education, we use video materials not produced for pedagogical purposes, but still useful in some regard. And also, what I think is important here, video as a tool for learning. And here it's when students make videos, or when we record students doing something. And then live video, which has been around quite a long time, video conferencing, but what is emerging and being used more and more every day, I would say, is desktop video conferencing. So the possibility to have meetings and video conference by your own computer. So every computer you buy today or a smartphone has a camera and has a microphone, and that's really simplified using video in everyday use. Then you've chosen two theoretical perspectives, and the first one of these is the socio-cultural perspective. And I think all the researchers in Gothenburg, I think you're very aware of this perspective, and that's, as you described it as not one theory, but rather a term for several theories understanding learning, development, and reproduction of knowledge and skills in social practices. And then the other theoretical perspective is the theory of affordances, which is defined in a very different context from this, but here's the original definition from Gibson, which is that the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnitures, either for good or ill. But then this theory has been popular in many different subject disciplines, and when we look at IT and learning, this is how Andrews and Haythornthwaite adopt it. And they write that affordances in IT and learning is about the use of technology which can facilitate or inhibit student learning depending on the affordances, and that's possibilities and constraints of technology. Then I think I won't go through all of these in details, but I think here and there you find other concepts, other theories that I think have been influential to you. And these are some of them. There are probably some other important concepts, but to illustrate. So, of course, here interaction and communication are central concepts. We mentioned the theory of interaction. You also bring up and a few times come back to social presence, and it's this idea that as humans we perceive a certain social presence, and for example, when communicating through video technology, it can be a challenge in achieving social presence. So how do we relate to others and see them as a real human being? So we're not communicating with a machine, but there is actually someone behind there. Media richness, which I think is a very discussed theory, but it's this idea, critically discussed theory, which is this idea that different media are richer than others, and in that sense, video is often described as a rich media. You can see each other express verbal cues, non-verbal cues. Yes, to some extent, but to some extent, as you mentioned. Thank you for that. And also, you bring up also this idea of technology. I'm running out of words. Technological, pedagogical content knowledge. So early on, when we talked about teacher knowledge, we have focused very much on the pedagogical and the content competence and really how these interact. But some argue that when more and more technology is emerging into these settings, this is also a competence, a technological competence, and that's a competence that interact with these others. When looking at the studies, these are the two major studies. So the national web-based questionnaire, a very ambitious project trying to reach all courses during a certain year, 2009. And then following this with an interview study at the teacher education institution. And I already said that it was Karlstad in this case. So the idea here, I briefly mentioned this, but to go deeper, is to do in the interview, in the explorative questionnaire, provided a general review on the use of different categories of video in Swedish distance higher education on a national level, while the interview study is of the use of video conferencing in teacher education program at a university in Sweden, in Karlstad, that gave a detailed and contextualized picture. And I will briefly summarize some of your conclusions, and I think it's really, and that's sort of a challenge, because there are many factors, and those are related to the typology, and you look at them from different angles in the thesis. So what I did was thinking about what are the most important conclusions, and I studied your abstract to really see what do you think are the most important conclusions, and those are the ones I will focus on here. So one of those that is important, and I think it's very important for the research, is that video is mostly used as a supplement to other resources. So it's unusual to have a course entirely based on video. And that means that if we want to understand video, it's also how it's used in relation to other technologies. And then another important conclusion, I think, is that you come back to several times, is this correspondence between teachers' experience of distance education, their participation in in-service training, and their use of video in teaching. And I think you often have this argument that if teachers are to understand and to use video in effective ways, they need to have some kind of in-service training that can be courses or professional development. And you see that as an important factor. Then also it's a lot about, so some teachers do use video, but why do some choose or not use video? And you look at this from different angles, but teachers report that they don't use video because it doesn't bring anything and it takes too much time. And I think these kinds of conclusions, we see them when we look at different technologies used in distance education. It's sort of, I'm not using it because I don't think it will be useful, or it takes a lot of time. I don't have that time to prepare or to learn how to use these technologies. And here I think you also come back to this argument that when teachers say that it doesn't bring anything, what does that mean? Might it be that they don't understand how they could use video, and then I don't understand how it could add value to the course? And I also think this argument takes too much time. Often it's a lot of things behind that. It's something people tend to say, I don't have time. But why do they say that they don't have time? Sometimes they don't have time, but sometimes it's covering something else, I think. Another, then looking at more at the constraints, it's related to time, as I said, and I think this was an interesting tension that you discussed. So there's this competition between a student-centered approach and a feeling of responsibility of delivering content. So here, at least in that study in Karlstad, there was the teachers had a limited time, and then they felt using video, and then they felt that they needed to deliver all the content. And that's quite typical, that teachers feel that if I have delivered all the content, I've done my part, so to speak, and then they would say that they don't have time for more student-centered approaches. And again, there might be something behind there. Maybe it would have been better if they did more student-centered approaches, but that's maybe beyond the scope of understanding that in the thesis. And then you also come back a lot to this challenge of non-verbal signals. Here's that word, and that it affects communication negatively, and especially the larger the groups get. So typically it has been difficult to see facial expressions of people. Sometimes they're outside the camera. Sometimes you see many people are squeezed together, and it's difficult to see them. So that's a challenge you bring up. So this was my short presentation, trying to give a background and a presentation of some of the conclusions.
So this means that you, Lena, now get a chance to briefly comment on Stefan's summary, if you like.
Okay. I thank you very much, Stefan, because I recognize everything that you said. So I have no objections, and there is nothing that you have misunderstood or anything. And I also think that you have brought up the most important part in my thesis. So it's really fantastic to listen and see this presentation, because I really recognize it, and I can be behind it fully. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so now I leave the word back to you, Stefan, to guide the questioning and discussion.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so now we're going back to the title. I was thinking that's a good way to start. And here you've put digital distance education as the main title and video in the subtitle. Could you explain why you did that? How are you thinking?
Well, from the beginning, I had video in the first title, but then I realized that the more I read it and the more I thought about it, that this thesis is very much also about digital education, digital distance education, and also, as you mentioned, the development and the difference that we now have digital distance education and not distance education. So I realized that I need to broaden the perspective in the title. So it was the video, or the thesis is not only about video, it's very much about digital distance education from the teacher's perspective. And also the facts that I found in my investigations about the background of the teachers, and that they had, many of them, about 50% of them, did not have any in further education in distance education, or that they have very little experience, about 50% of them, how it is to teach within distance education. And that it also means and entails that you use technology. And in that case, I thought that it is better to have digital distance education first, and then that I focus on video in that aspect.
Mm. Thank you. I also had another question. I was thinking, how would you say that about the title? How would you say that the thesis is longitudinal?
Well, it started in 2009. I then prepared the survey, and that was an adventure in itself, as the survey crashed when I was going to send it out. But the courses, or the email addresses for the course coordinators that I collected, they had a course during the springtime in 2009. But I made the investigation in the autumn because I wanted them to have had the course, and the course that they most recently have taught. That was the course I wanted to select. But the interviews were made in 2011, so that was 2 years later. Mm. And also that during my time, I've been an educational developer since 2011. During this time, and also before, I've been working with technology and implementation of technology in these contexts. And I think that my work has also made me reflect, and I have seen a lot, and I've studied a lot, and also kept up with research and so on during this time. So I have a very long perspective, I think, because I also use this technology. I also recorded video lectures. I also use video conferences in my work desktop conferences very often and so on. So it's both about my own experience from the practice and also the things that I've done in these two studies.
Yes, so if I understand it, it's maybe quite an unusual way of talking about longitudinal, but longitudinal in that you have used the technology over a long time, but also between these studies, they were conducted 2009 and 2011. Yeah. The reason I ask, often when we talk about longitudinal, one example could be to do, if you have done the survey, say, a couple of times between 1 or 2 years to see a development, but this is more like a personal longitudinal.
Yeah, but also it has taken quite a long time to analyze the results of the national study, because that was, as you said, a very big one. And that means also that it has been reflections and so going on for rather a long time. And since the case of Karlstad was selected due to the results from the survey study, so that was also, those 2 years also was a part of, and then also what happened afterwards. So, but I understand that you can see it in different ways.
Yes, and then we'll go on and look at the thesis and at the aim of the thesis. And I've showed you this earlier to better understand the possibilities and limitations of video in digital distance higher education. And then I put on the slides what you write, that the research has 3 elements of analysis. So video technology, distance courses, and distance teachers. And I think I have to ask, and I think you knew that I would ask these questions, what about the students? How can we better understand these possibilities and limitations without studying students?
Well, in this case, I have decided, you always make choices when you do research, and I have decided to focus on the teacher's perspective. But of course, the teachers, they are organizing and planning their teachers, their teaching with the students in front of them and doing it for the students. You can also see, if you study the research that has already been conducted, that the perspective of the students, that is covered rather well in research, but the teacher's perspective has not been researched as much. So therefore I decided to, and I've been a distance student myself rather much, but I also taught since 1994 in distance courses. So I was very interested in how the teachers saw their work and the possibilities and the limitations that they experienced in their work.
Yes, something I was reflecting on when I read your thesis is often we do this argument, we say that now we had a lot of research about the students, now it's time to ask the teachers, and we do that in different other research areas as well. And I was thinking, why do we so rarely look at the relationship between teachers and students? So I'm thinking like video technology can be used in so many different ways. If we talked about lecture-centered, student-centered, and so on. Did you think about that? Is there any? Did you think about trying to understand that relationship?
Well, I decided not to cover that in these investigations, because actually the ones that I did, the national study and the interview study, that was really too much. Yeah. So to actually get something else in there, that wouldn't have been possible. Then it would have been much longer, and it would have taken much longer time. Yeah. But I quite agree with you that it's very important that you also have the student's perspective. But I think that in this case, I wanted to focus on the teacher's perspective. And I think also that the student's perspective is present in the investigations. Since, for instance, if you think about video as a tool for learning, in that case, it's the student who make the productions, for instance. And then, of course, they can do things that they can't do without this category of video. So, and the teachers in the interviews, they talk a lot about the students. I think they are very present. If you read the excerpts from the interviews and all, I have read everything they said, and listened to it. I can see that the teachers at Karlstad University, they think very much of their students, and they really focus on making the situation for the student as good as possible.
Yeah. Of these three elements, I was thinking about one of them is distance courses. How would you say that has been an element of analysis?
Well, maybe it isn't so very clear now, because from the beginning there were a lot of there were questions in the survey about the distance courses, how many credits they were, and how many courses were carried out in different higher education institutions, in what subject matters, they used video and so on. But since it has taken time before the thesis was finished, so then I thought that kind of information was less important now. But the courses is also important because in the survey the teachers have been asked in how many courses they use these 6 categories of video, and that means that we get some knowledge about how they teach those courses, that this kind of material or these kinds of methods, for instance, for bridging the geographical gap between students and teachers, they use this. So in that way, there's still a lot of information about the courses because how they are carried out. So in that case, I think they should be there anyway, even if it's not as important as it was from the beginning.
Yes, thank you. So we will move on and talk more about the explorative questionnaire. So it provided a review on the use of different categories of video in Swedish distance higher education on a national level. So I was thinking, why is it important to provide a general review of video in Sweden?
I think that Sweden is very interesting because in Sweden we have the dual mode. And other countries, they have single mode. And the difference is that in single mode, the higher education institutions only focus on giving and offering distance courses. In Sweden, we have taken the decision that the same higher education institutions should work with both campus education and distance education. And that had consequences. Because if you can focus on only distance education, then you can also put a lot of resources for producing materials and video and everything. But if you are going to give campus courses and distance education courses, then there is another other situation and there are other conditions. And that also means that, as I have discovered in my study, that many particularly the study in Karlstad, the teachers told me during the interviews that the campus courses, they are norm for even the distance courses. So they don't develop the distance courses from the beginning. They often develop the campus course first, and then, oh yes, as a teacher said, we are going to give that at the distance also. Okay, we have to fix that, more or less. So that means that the organization and planning of the courses, and now it's also important that the courses are present in the thesis. So that means that the focus is more on the course and as the campus courses as norm for the design of the courses and organization of the teaching.
Yeah, so the argument here is then is that Sweden is different from others, and then we need to do studies in Sweden. And would you then say that the research is it mostly interesting in Sweden, or is it also interesting from an international perspective?
It's not only Sweden who has this, has this dual mode. So this is an example of a country with dual mode, and it's not only Sweden.
No.
But of course, for me, it was interesting to investigate the context where I work, and that was the reason for selecting Sweden.
Yeah. And then we'll talk also about the interview study. So the idea here is that it complements the survey and looking at the teacher education in Karlstad. And you write that it gave a detailed and contextualized picture. Could you elaborate a bit on this? A detailed and contextualized picture of what, more specifically?
Of the use of video conferencing, I would say, and also how the courses were organized. The thing that I found very interesting, which I didn't know at all before, was that, and that is because I have never taught any practical subjects through video conferencing, but the good idea that we should have the teacher education, and in that case also different subject matters in order to cover as much as possible. Because of that, I discovered that the teachers teaching practical subjects, they had a totally different view of working with with video conferencing. Because preschool teachers, for instance, they wanted to be out in the wood, and that wasn't possible in a video conference situation. They wanted to be able to count things that you can find in the natural surroundings, and they got problems with that. And the teachers working with physics and chemistry, they wanted to show experiments in lab work in the video conference situation, but they had problems because all the things that they wanted to do, they were not visible for the students in the local study centers. So that meant that they had to have, the teachers needed to very carefully plan the teaching so that things that were not visible, experiments for instance, that they were organized for the course meetings when they met on campus. And they could only use other things which didn't need to be visible in that case in the video conferencing. So that was a thing that I never heard before, and I never realized that this could be a problem. And I think that this is a very detailed description of, because the teachers, they didn't only have to plan the course and plan for the teaching, they also have to think about, okay, now we are here in this module and in this content, this part of the content, and I want to have this laboratory work, but it can't be used in video conferencing. All right, then I have to plan it for the physical meeting with the students. And then, of course, it might not come in the good time because they could have left that part already when they met on campus. So this is really something that complicates and challenges the distance teacher. It complicates the teaching structure and their design of the teaching.
Yes, I think you. Something that I was thinking about is Karlstad University, the teacher education there, and they developed a quite specific distance education model which they encouraged or even required their teachers to use. So something I was thinking about was that what findings are about that specific situation, and to what extent are there findings that are I don't like the word generalizable, but it's what we're talking about, so I'll use it anyway. And I think you just mentioned a very good example of something that would surely be relevant beyond. But how did you feel about that? You chose Karlstad, and it was quite a specific way of doing distance education. You can start thinking about how relevant is this for others. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I've thought about that. I selected Karlstad. The reason was the data from the survey, because they were in a special class in the survey, you could say. So their teachers had more experience of video conferencing. They had more experience of using video in general. And also, as you mentioned, the Karlstad University has a long experience and a long tradition of distance education in general. But I think that the teachers were forced to use video conferencing in this model. But I think that it's it's not so often that a teacher can choose in other higher education either, because if you have an organization, an infrastructure for an education, it's not certain that you can actually decide yourself. I know that some teachers, about the time when I made this study, there were some teachers, they were trying to work with desktop conferencing instead, in order to obtain a higher degree of flexibility for students, because desktop conferencing, then they could take part of the teaching from everywhere. But with video conferencing, they either have to be in Karlstad or at the local study center, because this equipment was required. So I think that very often you have this problem that the organizer have decided very much from the beginning regarding these things. Of course, they don't decide how you are going to teach and so on, but often the infrastructure is often decided by somebody else on another level than on the teacher's level. So in that case, I think that, and it wasn't so very special. The special thing was maybe about the local study centers. But during that time, when I conducted this investigation, it was rather common with the local study centers. I think it has declined a bit, but I think it's coming back now, because we have a need for lifelong learning, and you have to also provide and offer the kind of courses that people really can attend, because you work and you need to have a new education and so on. So I think it's coming back with the local study centers, but for a while it has been not so much used.
Yeah, thank you. So moving on, this is quite a long part from the thesis, but you write that in this thesis I define video as digital moving pictures and sound, including both video and television, which are used in higher education. Then you write that it has also been necessary to restrict the scope of certain types of video in this thesis, and, for example, video games, holograph computing, and the combination of PowerPoint slides, the teacher's voice, and/or still images of the teacher are not included in the definition of video in the thesis. So this is part of the discussion of what is video and what is it not. And I think maybe that discussion is becoming even more complex as video is integrated with more and more other technologies. But I had one example that I feel that many teachers use today, and that's the combination of PowerPoint slides and the teacher voice, and you record it as a video. Isn't that video to you, or did I read a mistake?
I decided to make, you make choices always when you do research, and I decided to make that limitations of the study, because I think also that even if the picture of the PowerPoint is changing, it's not moving in that way as you can have the social presence of the teacher and so on. So that is the reason.
Yeah. No, I think it's very interesting, and I think we need to discuss, of course, if we want to develop video, what it is. But I think many teachers would probably think they're doing video. But now you're saying, no, you're not doing video.
I agree on that. But that was also why it was important to also mention that this is a limitation, and that is outside the study.
Yeah. And what would you say if we say video conferencing with study centers, as you mentioned, you have studied, where a teacher is showing slides and talking to these slides, and often the students don't say much, they just listen. Why is that video?
That is video because the picture of the teacher is, I mean it doesn't have to be two-way video for making it video. So that is how I make the distinctions. But there, for instance, where I work now at Dalarna University, we have often lectures that we have students in the room, and they can ask questions and so on, and we have a lot of students. Most students maybe be at a distance, and they can write questions, and that was the same. It's not the same system, but it was the same idea as they did in Karlstad. So the students could, if they were not in a local study center, they could write questions to the teacher, but that was only in text and not in video, and not oral questions.
Mm. Thank you. I have one more slide with some questions about specifically the technologies of video. So here in the thesis you summarize the main step in the use and development of video in education. And it's presented here on this slide, but it ranges from the 60s, and we talked about this earlier with television, all the way to today, where we have other technologies. How would you say, if we look at the 2000s here, how would you say that the trends here were webcams, laptops with camera, smartphones with camera, how have that, affected your thinking about your thesis and your thesis work?
No, I don't really know if I understand your question.
Yeah. So during this time, there's been a lot of technical development, and suddenly these technologies emerge where you use video in very different ways than when you did your empirical studies. Have you been thinking about that?
Yes, but I think that it's only the development that is continued from the earlier days when you had the analog video. And then it was complicated to record, it was complicated with video conferencing. You had to have a very big studio, and the connection was very bad, and so on. But then the technical development has made it much easier. It's easier to produce video. Even during that time, it's easier to broadcast it, to distribute it, and it's easier to edit it. And I think that development is only something that had continued with these devices that you mentioned, with smartphones and tablets and so on. And the easier it gets, the better it is, I think, because then the accessibility to the technology gets even better, and it's easier. And also, a very important point, I think, is that it has been a development from that the teacher has produced the video, and now the students are the producers also. So the students have previously been consumers of video, but they are now producers. And that is something also I bring up in the thesis, and that is an extremely important change in development.
Yeah. Yes, and that's good that you brought that up. So in 2010 here we can see user-generated video as something that has been part of this of your studies, but also lecture capture and a bunch of technologies that I'm not sure really if they're video, but we don't need to go into that. I'm thinking of 3D worlds and things like that. Is that really video? But do you think, like, would you have that's just something you can speculate on, but since you did the studies at a certain point in time and then you have all these new technologies emerging, would you have similar conclusions today, do you think? Or would they be different after these technical developments?
I think it depends on what parts that you are thinking of. But I think that still what has been very, very present in the studies, particularly at Karlstad, but also actually in the national study, because one of the most important disadvantages with video conferencing from the national study was that the teachers couldn't act in the teaching situation as they wanted. They felt restrained in their teaching. And I think, and it was therefore very interesting to do the follow-up study at Karlstad, because then I could I didn't really understand what they meant by that in the national study. But then when I interviewed a teacher at Karlstad, they told me that they had to be seated on a chair. They couldn't move because in that case they needed to change the camera angle, and the sound disappeared and so on. So they were actually chained by this chair, and that meant that their teaching profile, the teachers they were and have developed for many years, that was restrained. They felt so limited. I think that they describe it in a way, I would say that they felt that their hands were tied. And that meant that it affected very much their teaching. So, and I think that still, still there are problems that we think a lot about technology, but we don't really think so much about the teacher. And how will this working environment be for the teacher? How will it be to teach in this situation using this technology? So and I see it also in my work that you have a screen that is very big, then it's in the lecture hall, then it's difficult to see the students. You have to, if you work with desktop conferencing, you have a lot of things that you have to manage. There could be messages from the student in the chat. It could be students raising their hand that you need to observe, and you also lecture, and you also try to get the students active. I think that the teachers, that is really a lot of things to do at the same time, and I think it would be very important to actually think about the teacher's teaching environment. And I think that development hasn't been so very fast, so I think that we have still a lot of things to do there.
Yes, certainly we do. We'll go back to this typology, which I think is one of the important contributions of this thesis. You try to make sense of these different types of video. Could you share some reflections on how you developed this? Did you think about any other categories, or could this have been presented in any other way?
I can say that that has really been a development, and I have changed a bit about the categories during writing this thesis. I had to decide on these categories from the beginning when I sent out the survey, because when studying the literature and the research on video, I realized that it was very seldom that the researchers really defined what they have investigated. And it was not unusual that they had investigated several, what I call categories of video in the same study, and not really reflecting about what could be the difference in the result. If you, for instance, if you study how students perceive video lectures and video-based material in one study, and they don't, if they had asked questions about one of each at a time, that would be fine, but they ask questions about everything at the same time. So that was what I realized, that you really need to distinguish and decide on different categories. So, but one thing that I changed from the study, the web questionnaire, that was not divided into live and recorded video from the beginning. So that is one thing that I have changed. That is one of the developments that I realized. And another thing is that video as a tool for learning, that was a third category before from the main categories, but then I realized that that category is always recorded. So when I decided to have live video and recorded video, that solved some of the problems.
Yeah.
So this has really been a development. So it was not, the categories are not the same. They are partly the same, but the structure is different, and they different, particularly with the main categories with live and recorded video.
Yes, I also think you did a good job. I think recorded and live is very important when you, especially maybe as a beginning teacher, start to think about how can I use video, that they're completely different. Something I was thinking about is that it's always challenging when you do a typology, you make decisions, you can't capture anything, everything. I think my sound is coming and going. Yeah, it's about, what I was thinking about is how does this capture how teachers use video? And maybe that can be a challenge here. So for example, if you look at video conferencing that you have studied, you know, you can use it in a very teacher-focused, lecture-centric way, and you can use it in a very student-centered group discussions, those kinds of things. You can do desktop video conferencing for hundreds of people not allowing to speak, or you can have these small group discussions and things. Have you thought about that, the use of video?
Yes, because that was the very important thing. Because if you just investigate, if you start with video and don't make the distinctions between the different categories, then you will find many different uses of video. But you will not be able to realize maybe that there are different categories that are used in different ways. So that was the important thing with the survey, that I needed to define these categories for respondents. So they have been asked questions about video conferencing separately, and then I got answers about how they used video conferencing, and then I also did the same with desktop conferencing for instance, and they had a discussion from the beginning that it was unnecessary to have video conferencing separate to desktop conferencing, but I was very subsistent and decided that I needed to do it like this. And the results showed that there are differences in use. I mean, video conferencing is mostly used for groups, and desktop conferencing is mostly used for individual students. But also that this case, that it's a difference between used for groups and individual students, also meant that how the teachers used those two were different, and that you can see from the results in the national study. So I'm very happy today that I really decided, no, I should have those two separately, because they are used in different ways, and you learn different things if you study them separately.
Yes, thank you. I agree with that as well. So we will also look at the theoretical perspectives. So we had two, as I mentioned, one being the social perspective, social cultural perspective, theories for understanding learning, development, reproduction of knowledge and skills in social practices. What would you say, what does it mean to be interested in video from a social cultural perspective? What did it mean for your research?
That perspective was very important, because it's since you use technology, and in my study technology is used to mediate, for instance, lectures or lessons or laboratory work. That means also that you can see that is important for analysis, because you can see also that in some the technology have the possibilities, but it doesn't always happen as you think that it will happen. And I think that video conferencing and desktop conferencing is very much used with intention, that there should be a two-way communication between teachers and students, but it's not always that the case is like that. So the mediating function and that the social cultural perspective is much about language, and that means not only the language we speak, it also means non-verbal cues, as we discussed before, and that is a way also of being able to see that was a problem in the video conferencing, in particular if there were large groups and many students, that the teacher couldn't see the non-verbal cues, the gestures, the facial expressions, the body postures, and so on. And that is the sociocultural perspective means that the tool, the technical tool, could mediate the situation, but what I see in my study is that doesn't always happen.
Mm. Yes, so you talk about mediation here, which is a central concept here, and maybe also the social part. What would you say about cultural?
The social part and the cultural part is also very important, of course. And the social part, because we discuss and we communicate in a social environment, and that has also with communication to do, as you said, and also the perspective that a communication situation, we expect certain things in a communication situation. We expect that we get some kind of response. You were nodding now when I was talking, and I've been nodding before, and that means that I get some kind of response to what I say, and that is something that we are expected to have in the communication situation. And if we don't have that, we experience the situation as very awkward and very strange. And I think that affects the communication, and that is exactly also what the teachers, for instance, at Karlstad University bring up in the interviews.
Mm. Yes, we'll take the next one here. And then looking at the theory of affordances, and I've already introduced that. How would you say that adopting this theoretical perspective, the theory of affordances, have affected your research?
I think it has been very important because, as I said before, the technology offers certain possibilities, but it's not the features we are talking about. The feature is more when you could push a button, you can have a certain thing happening. You can, if you push a button, the video plays and so on. That is one thing. But here is in the interaction between the teacher and the students, and that is something else. Features are parts of the technology that always are there, but if you think about affordances, then it's in the interaction instead, and that it's situated, so it depends on the situation, it depends on the conditions and so on. So that is very important for my results, that I could see that even if we think that we have these possibilities, the limitations, then the constraints, make this very problematic sometimes. So even if we use video conferencing in order to mediate a lesson or a lecture, for instance, but the result is not the same if you can't see the expressions of the students, you can't see response, how they respond to what you are saying, and so on. So therefore, the affordances means both possibilities but also limitations. And I think that is very important.
Mm. Yes, I'm thinking that I'm trying to see if is there anything this theory brings, beyond looking for benefits and limitations. So often in research, aims and research questions are posed in that way. We are looking for benefits, we're looking for limitations or opportunities or challenges or something like that. We want to see both views. What would you say this theoretical perspective gives us beyond looking for these, as is stated here, possibilities and constraints, but you often talk about benefits, limitations. Why is it useful beyond that?
I think it's very useful because if you realize the constraints with technology, then you can also often reduce those constraints. But if you are not aware of them, that you probably do nothing about it. So I think that one of the results that I would like that the teachers using video conferencing and having problems with experiencing problems having contact with the students, I think that if they understood that it had to do with the communication situation, that we are expected certain signals that we don't get, maybe it would be easier for them to understand why they feel like this, why they feel that it's very difficult to lecture if you have a screen in front of you and you don't have any students, and you just have to speak into the screen, and you don't get any response at all, and if they had this knowledge, if they understand why they are experiencing this as problematic, I think it would help them. When they still have to do it, maybe, but it would help them to understand.
Mm. Yes, and I was thinking in the aim, you talk about benefits and limitations, and here, for example, now you mentioned constraints as a key word.
Mm.
So if we will talk about that, constraints of a technology and limitations of a technology, does that mean the same thing? What do these terms mean? Are they the same term or different terms? Constraint and limitation?
I think that constraint is more related to a specific situation, and limitations could be that the technology can't really do the things that we want it to do, but constraints is more in a specific situation.
Okay.
In the interaction.
Yeah, so it's different in the meanings. Okay, thank you. And as I mentioned, I've showed this slide before, but there's you have other also concepts and theories that gave a very extensive background, I would say, to digital distance education. And we won't go through all of them, but I was a bit curious because you have this chapter on digital distance education that has some theoretical parts and concepts, maybe some in the video part as well, and then you have this theoretical background that provides this social culture theory and theory of affordances that really, these are my main theories here. Could you reflect a bit on that? We don't need to talk about all of them, but are these important in your research, or was it social cultural learning theory and theory of affordances that are those that you needed to use?
I think that for the analysis, I think that the theory of affordances and social cultural perspective was most important, but also Moore's theory of interaction. That has also been very important for the analysis, because those three perspectives, for instance, when you think about that teachers feel a very high responsibility, as you said before, about delivering the content. Then it's more the content perspective, student content perspective, than actually the student-teacher interaction perspective. So in that case, I think that those perspective has helped me a lot to think about this. I think that maybe the media richness perspective is less important. It's more that in the context that you can mediate the teaching situation, and it gets as close as possible to a physical meeting in a teaching situation. In that case, it's important, but not so very much otherwise. The social presence, I think, is important, because it's important for the motivation of the students, because if you have a lecture with a teacher who doesn't have any social presence, then it's going to be very difficult to concentrate, and it can be difficult for the students to be motivated to study, because then you have again this human communication. I mean, we see each other we look each other in the eyes when we communicate. If people are looking in other directions, we feel a bit awkward about that. And if you don't have a teacher who looks into the camera when teaching, that they can't see the body language and the facial expressions, it creates a kind of uncertainty in the communication situation. And in that case, I think it's important.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I also agree. Social presence seemed very, very central, and you get back to that. So maybe that could have been a candidate for one of the big theories. I think you also combine affordances and three types of interaction in a nice way, and that they complement each other, because the theory of three types of interaction, I think, helped you to see what to look for when looking for those constraints. So that was nice to see. Maybe a bit surprised by the media richness, because there's been so much criticism on that, so much debate. So bring it up and then not really using it, I was a bit surprised by that, but that can certainly be discussed. Okay, so we'll go on and look at the studies in more detail. So you did the national survey, a very ambitious project, and I was thinking if you could, and maybe we've partly done this, but if you could reflect a bit about. So the survey was done in 2009, and now it's 2020. Could you reflect a bit on that? What kind of findings from this survey do you think are still relevant today, and where do you think things have changed?
I think that video might be used more today than before when I did the study, but we also know that within higher education it doesn't go so very quickly, particularly not when technology is in the picture. So I think that is one thing to be remembered. I think also that this category of video that is not produced for pedagogical purposes but used still in education, I think that category is used more now than it was in 2009. And I think that it's interesting that I haven't been able to find any study which investigates that. So I think that is a very important field to further investigate.
Yes.
And it's also interesting to see the differences between that category of video that is mostly used for discussion, to bring up a discussion with the students, and maybe also for motivation from the national study. You can see those results, but not so much with the purpose of actual learning. And actual learning is more important than in learning video-based materials, for instance, and of course video-recorded teaching situations.
Yes, and when you present the survey, you present it in a descriptive way, so you don't present statistical tests. Can you explain why you don't do that?
We did a lot of statistical tests from the beginning, but only the results that are in the thesis, only those results were relevant to present, actually. And what I didn't think about from the beginning was also that the study is very big, but when you think about the different categories of video, then the categories and the number of courses and the number of teachers are very much reduced if you divide them into these 6 categories. And if you then start to think about men and women and different ages and different courses and different subject matters, then actually the court was very small in many ways, and then the point wasn't so interesting any longer, because then it was difficult to generalize anything, because it was maybe 15 or 20 in certain cases, and the other one is 740 teachers and 1,246 courses. So that is the reason.
Yeah. So basically, it was difficult to find statistical significance.
Yes, it
That's
was.
what you're saying. Yeah. I was thinking about this. Here's a result from the survey study, and I'll read it. It is an important result that the national survey showed a correlation between, on the one hand, the course coordinators' experience of distance education and participation in service training, and on the other hand, their use of video in distance courses. So I was thinking about this word correlation here. Was there a correlation, or wasn't there a correlation?
There was a correlation,
Yeah,
there was a correlation. But I can't say that, correlation is one thing, so I could see the correlation. But and I was a bit surprised about that, because I thought that it was clear in different situations. I mean, it was that teachers with more experience in distance education, not experience in video, in using video, but experience in distance education. That is a very important distinction. They used video in more courses. They used more categories of video in the same course. And they also used, and also the difference that teachers with more experience and in-service training, they used categories of video that were more demanding regarding the knowledge from the teacher's knowledge, because video conferencing was something that they used, but the teachers with less experience of distance education, or with very little or no further studies in distance education, they used video categories as video-based materials, for instance, or video recorded teaching situations. So they used those categories that didn't demand so much in regard of the knowledge of the teacher. So I think that was also very interesting, not only that they used video more, or that they used several categories in the same course, but also that there was a difference between the different categories, depending on if the teachers had a lot of experience in distance education, or they have participated in further training.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's quite many variables I think we're talking about and discussing. And when you say correlation here, because now you mentioned quite a number of correlations. Were all these statistically significant?
Yes.
Yes, and were there strong correlations or weak correlations?
They were rather strong, yes.
Rather strong, yeah. So the reason I ask is it's quite unusual to talk about correlations, but not presenting the figures. So, so to see how strong was it and what were the numbers behind it. That surprised me a bit. And when talking about statistics, I was thinking we also had a question about correlation and causation. Because
causation we don't know anything about, because I couldn't prove that.
No, so I was thinking, like, if we have a correlation between these variables, could it be, let's say that we have teachers who are more inclined to test teaching strategies, more including using videos, and these are typically the teachers that tend to show up when we have in-service training or seminars. Do we know about that? Do you see what I mean? It could be that we have interested teachers, they use video, and they also go to training, but maybe it's not training that supports them in improving the use of video. Do you have any reflections on that?
Of course, it's often that the same teachers who are interested, they are the same coming to in-service training. But I think that also, since the cohort is so big, it's 740 teachers, I think that the risk that is the only reason is not so very big, because it's many teachers. And I think also, since the experience of distance education was very clear, that meant that they also used more videos. I think that is related that way.
Yeah, thank you. And then some more detailed discussion about the Karlstad study, the interview study. And let's see, I think we've talked about parts of what I wanted to ask about. A quick question, but if you would have done a qualitative study today, if you go back in time and think about you chose Karlstad, would you have done that same decision now if you traveled back in time? If you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, but I don't understand which decision. Was it to
do the study in Karlstad? You could have done the study in Dalarna or at KTH or somewhere else.
Yeah. I don't know that, but since the decision was based on the results of the national study, that was the reason why it was Karlstad University. But I wouldn't have chosen Karlstad for any other reason, I think, but in the national study, the results show that Karlstad was really in a special division, and I think that it's important also to in order to find good examples, it's good to to investigate higher education institutions who have been working with this for a long time, because it's difficult to start if you haven't done it before. It's difficult to start, and it was the same thinking I had regarding choosing video conferences to investigate instead of desktop conferencing, because desktop conferencing that was something that came during 2009 when the contract with Adobe Connect came, and nearly all higher education institutions in Sweden could use Adobe Connect. But I thought that it takes time to learn to use the technology, maybe not to push the buttons, but how to use it in a good way in a teaching situation, which is something much more difficult and much more complex. And I think to investigate something that the teachers didn't have the opportunity to be familiar with and to learn how to use, I didn't like that idea, because I think it's important that you get the time and that you have the experience of using it first before you investigate how it works.
Yes. And when you discuss the method, something you bring up is that your ambition was to select teachers who had as many video conferences as possible. Why did you make this decision, and how do you think it affected your findings?
Well, I think it has to do with exactly what I just said, that I wanted to have teachers who had experience of using video conferencing. But that wasn't the case, because in order to find teachers and to make this happen in a good way, I thought very much about the subject matters, and I'm very glad that I did that, because as I said, I found data and interesting things that, for instance, it was difficult with the practical activities in video conferencing. And that was more important to find that, I think, than investigated teachers with a long experience of video conferencing. But most teachers had experience of video conferences, but there were also teachers in this group that I interviewed that only had 1 or 3 per year or per semester.
So your ambition was to have teachers with as many as possible, and then in practice it turned out... Yeah,
it didn't really come true.
Yeah, okay, thank you. This is one, I think, of several, of course, interesting findings from the Karlstad study, but you write that the teachers in the study argue that many activities had to be covered within limited time frames, which resulted in a competition between the activities such as student-centered activities and delivery of content. And this indicates that the teachers felt a strong responsibility for delivering content to students during the video conference. So to give a bit of a context, if I understood correctly, there was this studio room that teachers could book, and they had a certain number of hours, and then they tried to do as much as possible during that time. And they argued that they didn't have time to do more student-centered. They only had time to lecture. That was there.
But there are more things to it than that. The thing was that the idea in Karlstad was that each group starting had their own half day. So if you entered the teacher education, for instance, in a certain program, you might have Monday morning or something like that until lunch, and then you had Monday morning for the video conferencing until you were finished with the education, and another group had Tuesday morning, and so on. Since there were between 12 and 15 local study centers connected also, it was very difficult to have extra video conferences, and also that the studios in Karlstad were often fully booked. So that was the reason. But I think also that, which the teachers also mentioned in the interviews, that they needed to check that the sound worked. They needed to check that, and if you do that for 12 to 15 groups, it takes longer time than you have 2 or 3 groups. And it also takes some time every time for the picture to move from the one talking and the next one talking, because the picture is directed by the sound, and that also takes some extra time. And if there were technical problems, that took some time, and so on. So I think that there were different. The teachers were not really anonymous about that, because some teachers said that they had less time than on the campus courses with the distance courses in the video conferencing, but others said that they had more time. So I'm not quite sure which is true. But I think that there were things around the video conferencing that didn't exist in the campus meetings, and that also took time from the teaching.
Yeah. So these findings, we've talked about like the infrastructures and the local context of Karlstad and all this. And I was thinking about, so to what extent are the conclusions, so let's say this conclusion that teachers tend to prefer to lecture when using video, or is it when the setting looks like in Karlstad? Do you see what I mean? Is it about video, or is it about how you organize it? You know, how much time you have, how the technology works? Is it, what is it, hönan och ägget, like we say?
I think that it's rather complicated, because the teachers also say in the interviews that there are several examples of that they wanted to be in control. Some teachers wrote a manuscript, which they never did for the campus courses. Some teachers planned which local study center was going to have the questions and which question, and so on, which means a very, very detailed planning and organization of the video conferencing. And I think that those examples, that they wrote the manuscript and that they decided which local study center was going to answer which question, means also that they wanted to be in control. And if you have more interaction with students, it also means that you have less control. And I think that that could also be a part of the reasons why they lectured. And if you think about other research, you see that teachers who are not so familiar with the video conferencing environment, maybe focus much on the technology, they also tend to lecture more, because that is easier for them. So because you need to change pictures maybe, and you need to work with the microphones and the other things happening, so on. So I think that this could be really complicated. It's not so easy to answer that question, because I think behind those answers that they want to be in control and giving those examples also mean that they were a bit afraid of letting it loose to a higher degree and letting the students in for interaction.
Yes, yeah, it certainly seems like a complex relationship. And I was thinking a bit then about the interview as a research method. So when you interview someone, you ask questions, and you ask, like, you probably didn't, I'm not sure how you framed the question, but when asking someone, why don't you do more student-centered activities, the question is sort of, yes, I understand that you didn't ask that.
No.
Because you wouldn't have continued the interview probably. But still, it's sort of, how do you know what, you know, they will say something to you, but is that what they really think?
No.
Have you reflected on that?
Yes, I think that is something also I brought up in the discussion of the methods, and I had another problem also, that some of them knew that I had been teaching a lot in distance education. And that happened from time to time during the interviews, that they asked me questions, what would you have done? Do you have any tips about this? But I refrained from answering those questions, because then I would really lose my role as an interviewer. And I think that there is a risk that they were seeking for my approval and so on when they were talking about different things that they did. Because if they were unsure about this situation and they wanted to know what I recommended and so on, this could really be a problem. But I really tried to be as neutral as possible, and I didn't give any tips of what to do. No.
Maybe. So, what do you think about when you had done the interviews? Did you can do interviews in certain ways and have different views on on science and how you analyze those. Did you feel that you sort of believed what they said, or did you try to look for explanations for why they said certain things in the interviews? You see what I'm looking at?
I think I did both, actually. But and I don't think that the things that they said to me wasn't always the whole truth. But as for instance, when talking about this, about that they wanted to be in control and giving those examples, that this could be an example of why they didn't have so much interaction with the students, really.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. So I have some questions left, and I think before the final part we'll talk about the contributions. I put on a slide there, I put some more recent trends where, you know, video in higher education has really become more and more used and has become relevant beyond distance education, in the sense that more and more teachers integrate it with campus education, as you partly looked at in your thesis. And here are some trends. So flipped classroom, where you often use short videos to be able to lecture less and do more activities in the classroom. We have seen, maybe not so much in Sweden, but massive open online courses. This idea about courses open for everyone, very reliant on video, various forms of digital content, and user-generated or student-generated video, and we've already talked about that, I think. So what I was thinking is that you have been doing research on video for a very long time, and then we have these recent trends or phenomena emerging. Like, for example, if we take the flipped classroom as an example, how do you think your research could be used to inform these developments? I think when MIT did MOOCs, I think they thought that they were sort of doing something very new, and maybe it wasn't so new, or in certain aspect. What would you say? How could your research relevant guide such trends? What can we learn?
I think that we can learn many things. For instance, that it's important that you make this distinction between video as entertainment and video for learning, that you give the students assignments during their watching, so they are not just relaxing in the Friday afternoon or Friday evening in the sofa looking at television or video, so that they see the difference between those things. And that is also something that you often work with when you use the method of flipped classroom. So I think that is one thing, and also that students prefer shorter videos and not so very long videos. That is also something that I can see very clearly in the literature overview. I had also results which are not presented in the thesis about how the teachers recorded their teaching situations, because I think that is very important also. There were four alternatives. If you make a separate recording without any students, if you make a recording with students present, or if you make recordings with special arrangements, so that the recording could be used both for campus students and being present in the classroom, and for distance students. Because often in these recordings, when you make recordings during an ordinary lesson, it could be difficult for distance student to see what the teacher writes on the whiteboard, what is on the PowerPoint. The sound might disappear sometimes, and the teacher might get out of picture, which might affect the students' motivation and so on. So I think there are a lot of things to consider. It's not only that you make a recording of a teaching situation, it's very much that you think about how you do it, so that the students can get as much as possible out of it. But I see the development now that you can record several channels. You can have one channel for the teacher, and talking and moving and so on, one channel for the PowerPoint, one for the whiteboard, and one for experiment or something else. and that you can actually mix those channels into one, and the student can select. I want to only see and listen to the teacher now and then play that, or I want to have the PowerPoint and the teacher and play that. I think those possibilities that we have with the technology today, that the students can select different ways of getting to see the material and have the materials, the content presented to them. I think that development is something that I believe very much in, and that I think that is very promising.
Interesting. Yeah. So the final part of this discussion, I'm thinking we will conclude and reflect a bit on theoretical and the practical contributions. So to get us started in that, I was thinking a question I had is which findings, because when you started the research, you already knew a lot, so to speak. So sort of what findings surprised you the most?
I think that I was most surprised about this, that the most important disadvantage of video conferencing was that the teacher couldn't act as they wanted in a teaching situation. That I was really amazed about. I was also surprised that some teachers said that the high demands on very well planning was a disadvantage during video conferencing, but other teachers said that it was an advantage instead. And I think that was really interesting, that those contradictory results. So, but when I interviewed the teachers in Karlstad, I didn't get so much information about those who thought it was an advantage, but some of them talked about, for instance, how you structure your notes on the whiteboard. That if you have a very small whiteboard, as in the video conferencing environment, then you need to think through forehand in order how you could structure your material. Because if you just start writing, and then you will not have room for everything you want to write on this small whiteboard or blackboard. So I think that was interesting. But there were many things, I think. And also this part about that experience in distance education and in service training, that made such a big difference. That I didn't know from the beginning. I didn't think that it was that important.
No. Maybe I think this question is a bit connected, but if I'd like us to round off by looking at theoretical contributions and practical contributions, and it might be a challenge to maybe separate those. But could you reflect on? I think that connects with what you just said. But could you reflect some more on examples of findings that confirm what we already know from research, and findings that you feel extends beyond current research or new knowledge?
Well, I think that we already knew that it was. That it is difficult to have large group of students and many sites in video conferencing, and I think that also confirms that many of those technologies that we use in teaching are actually produced for something else, and I think that is something that I often explain that to the teachers I work with when I teach in teaching and learning in higher education, because I think it's important to remember when we think that it's difficult and we have problems to use technology in our teaching, it's good that we remind ourselves that, okay, it isn't so strange that this is difficult, because we have to tweeze it in different ways in order to make it suit into the ways that we want to use it in teaching and learning. And I think that is something that, and video conferencing is a very good example of that, because it was originally produced for business meeting with rather few participants and not so many groups. And now we try to use it for more, not industrial teaching and learning, but something in that direction, with many groups and many students in each group. And I mean, sometimes we think, also in campus, we sometimes have very big groups. And that isn't so easy either. I mean, I know that in teacher education here at Gothenburg, they have the teacher in one classroom, and in another classroom there is a group of students just watching what is happening in the other classroom where the teacher is. So, and that is a bit the same problem as in Karlstad with these many groups of students and large groups. So I think those things are important.
And I think we sort of moved into that, but what do you say then? Because my idea here was that we will first talk about theoretical contributions and then about practical. But I think we're doing maybe both right now. Could you try to think about sort of what are my theoretical contributions, what are my practical, or would you argue that they are sort of so intertwined so we can't distinguish them, or what would you say?
I think that especially the theory of affordance is regarding that, and that you know that technology offers certain parts that you can use, but then in the actual situation something else happens. And I think the key features doesn't work in certain situations. You can use it, but the use of it is not as you expected. And I think that is a very important contribution, because I think that is a way of analyzing the use of technology in this situation. And I think that could help us a lot. Also, not only that we could see the possibilities, but also that we can reduce or maybe remove the constraints that appear in certain situations. I had a very good example, a practical example from one of the groups that I taught in Gothenburg at the Peel unit. It was a colleague working at Sahlgrenska, and he told us about that they used iPads with the pictures of the different organs for an examination about the different parts and so on of the organs. From the beginning, they copied all the pictures, and it was a tough job for the teachers. And then someone realized that it could be very good to have iPads instead. And everybody was very happy because the pictures were so clear and the colors were good and so on, until they actually implemented it. Because the iPads had an internet connection, and this was an examination. And that is a very good example, I think, that you have to think about both the possibilities, but also what can happen, and how the situation is changed by the technology. So there are certain things that are good and positive, but other things happens as well. So I think this is a very good example. They have removed the internet connection now, and now it works. But it's a good example of that you need to think through everything, and using the theory of affordances is a good way of doing that, I think.
Yes, that's a very interesting example. I will summarize. I'd like to thank you for a good, engaging discussion with some non-verbal signals as well. It was really interesting to read your work, and I think especially one of the strengths, of course, is that you had the opportunity to reflect on video for a long period of time. Well, many of the studies we see maybe looked at, a flipped classroom in a certain setting or so on, but this is on another scale. And I hope also it can guide, more recent trends, in the sense that new research can see how we benefit from these. If it's longitudinal or not, we can discuss that, but these long time studies. I think the thesis, the typology gives many examples of many different ways of using videos, possibilities, challenges, and you really try to dig deep into these different types of video and reflected on benefits and challenges, not only as video as a whole, but trying to get deeper understanding. It was a really ambitious project to do a national study. We really need more of those ambitious big projects. So it was really nice that you need to be brave to do something like that. So it's good that you do that. And I think it's nice to see like an interview study as well, giving the teachers opportunities to share their views. And as you said, we have fewer of those studies. So in that sense, it's certainly valuable. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I also would like to thank you for a very, very nice discussion, and it has been extremely nice for me to listen to your summary of the thesis and to reflect on the answers of your questions. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Lena and Stefan. So now we go on to questions from the audience, and starting with the grading committee. So is anyone up for starting? Yeah, Sylvie?
Okay, thank you very much for this interesting discussion, and I'd like to catch up on something you said, because there have been so many things to talk about, but I would like to get back to something you said before, not long ago. You referred to Moore's 3 typologies, but when I hear you talking, to me it appears that you've added something which seems very important. Maybe it's implicit, but I think you talked about it in more explicit terms, and that was visible to me from referring to Moore. You talk about teacher-content interaction with technologies. And I would like to raise a question for reflection, perhaps. I guess you have a lot of data that is not possible to go back to, but you mention that you have data from different subject matters. And would you say that there are underlying teachers' norms linked to the subject matter traditions that are sort of not on the surface here? Or did you see or find anything of that as part of the difficulties and complexities that you have described in your data?
No, I can't say anything about that because I have not really investigated that. And I think that that also comes back to the problem I talked about before, because the cohort gets very small if you also divide them into the different subject matters. So I can't say anything about that.
Okay, thank you. A short follow-up question on that, looking into the future perhaps. You also say in your dissertation here that there is a need of in-service teacher training. And I was curious about how that could be designed for, given that there is a diversity among the teachers and subject matters. Perhaps we don't know that, but you do have references to the problems that the teachers are facing, and you have them mentioned, for example, as spontaneity versus detailed planning, the feeling of control. So, an in-service training. Given that the questions like, or challenges like space and time, verbal cues and so on, how would you think of designing for a teacher training to add or to contribute to the teachers becoming more prepared?
Well, that's a very good question, because I'm working with that, but I haven't. I think that if you, one example is, as we did when I worked at Mälardalen University, when the nurse education was going to be at a distance, they were going to use video conferencing. Then we actually trained in the video conferencing situation. So we had broadcasting from between Eskilstuna and Västerås, because it's very different to be in charge of a video conferencing. And they needed to present content, and they needed to think about this with student interactivity and so on. So I think that the best way of doing it is actually to practice in the situation that the teachers are going to use it. I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you did, so thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Ladies first.
Thank you very much. I enjoy this lucid discussion between you two. And I think that a lot of my questions were nicked by Stefan, which shows that the questions covered a very broad ground. My questions are more from a sort of a general perspective. I'm very interested in technology and how it affects the way we work. Given the concern that the teachers expressed in your research regarding the time aspect and their hesitation regarding, will this make any difference? From your perspective now, is there a way of working around that, and what would that be? What would your recommendation be to institutions and teachers, and how to resolve these dilemmas, if you like?
I think that it's a bit related to what Sylvia asked about also, that in-service training. Also to ask the teachers what their needs are. I mean, in the interview, they expressed that they wanted to be more comfortable with the technology. They wanted to learn more about to behave in the video conferencing situation, what clothes to wear, and thinking about spots and stripes and things like that, which can be a bit annoying for the audience. Also, how they could use PowerPoint in a better way. And what I tell and what I talk about for the teachers using desktop conferencing, for instance, where I work now, is that I also talk about that when you change picture, it's very good to tell the students that now I'm going to show a picture of this typology or whatever it is. Think about a bit how it works in the television, because if you just change the picture without saying anything, then the students just get something black on the screen, and then a new picture just pops up, and that gets a bit surprised. They get a bit surprised by that. So I think that those are the student perspective. I also would like to emphasize, because now I've been working also with teachers working in nurse education, because also at Dalarna they are going to start distance courses for nurses. So I'm there again, and they see their perspective very much. But it's also important that they look at the recordings and look at the video conferencing or what they are using, and see it. What would it be like if I am the student? How would I experience what is happening here? Because some teachers say that, well, there is no difference. Yes, there is a difference. If you are in the room, you can ask questions. The teacher can have an interaction with the students in the room. If you are at a distance, then the distance students don't hear the questions. They don't hear the answers from the students. And that is something that we are working with now to solve, so that there is going to be sound also from the students present in the classroom. Because otherwise it's just silent, and something is happening, and the distance students don't know what is happening, and then the teacher needs to repeat the question and answer and give an answer to the question, and that takes a bit time. So it's not a very good way of doing it. So those things, to also see the student's perspective, I think it's very important.
Thank you. I'm happy with that response. And a final question. What were your assumptions about technology when you started your research? And how have they changed? If you talk about technology in general, and of course video being one such technology.
Well, since I've been working with this ISDN lines since 1994 and so on, I had the experience of that, but I was a bit disappointed regarding that we haven't really learned how to use technology in the best way. I think that it might be different today. I don't know that because I haven't done this investigation now. But for the studies that I have results of, I thought that certain things, for instance, the situation for the teacher, that could have been improved much because technology offer possibilities and we don't really make use of them. So that is something I was a bit disappointed of.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Oh, shit. So thank you, Stefan and Lena, for a good discussion. Maybe I can talk without the microphone. Is that okay? I didn't want to hear it outside. Okay.
Now
sorry.
we have that problem with the sound.
Sorry, okay. I will start to follow up one of Stefan's questions about theory and the use of several theories. And I'm a little bit curious about what of all those theories you have used in a way capture a deeper understanding about teachers' attitude and perceptions.
I think that they have often a more positive picture of what technology can offer than what really happens sometimes. And that they have sometimes problems to see why there are constraints. I think that I'm wondering a bit about this, about communication, for instance, that they talk about that it's very hard to lecture when you don't get any responses. You just talk into a screen. And that they haven't taken a step back and thought about why do I experience this in this way. And I think that my results, by looking at the results through, for example, how we communicate and the affordances of technology and where there are constraints, that could be very helpful for these teachers. That is something I really hope, because if you understand why this situation occurs and the reasons for it, I think it's much easier for you to accept it and to maybe do things that can improve the situation.
Did you ever thought about using, for example, theories of teacher beliefs and the work of Triggle and Prosel and those guys?
No, I haven't, no.
Okay. My next question is about the literature review. And you have gone through about 500 papers or something.
Mm.
I will just see if I can find my notes somewhere and put my glasses on, it's easier. Now we'll see where my question was. Here we are. How did you identify those 500 papers? Did you use any search terms, specific databases? Which paper were included, excluded? What kind of the systematic behind the literature did you use?
Well, I can say that there are more papers than 500 in my literature review. This is really a problematic thing, because if you look for video, certain things turns up and not others. And there are a lot of terms that are used which are not really defined. The thing that I had most problems with was actually podcasting, because I read many articles about podcasting, and sometimes on the last page, in the conclusion, I realized that the article was not really about video, but about sound recordings. And I don't know how many articles I have decided not to use because of that. But I used all the normal terms of distance learning, distance education, and so on. Video conferencing is another problem, and you have interactive video, and ITV, which could stand for different things. So this is really a complicated matter. But I have made those research for articles on many occasions during these years, and also you always also pick up what is in the reference list of the articles that you have read. But I think I have about 14 or 15 files with articles. Those are really pretty full, and those are only the ones that I thought were useful to read. Many of them haven't been useful for me in my research. But I have used very much of literature from both the technological part and from the distance education part. Sometimes also realize that articles discussing distance education, they are not discussing distance education for higher education. And then maybe you don't use that article either.
So the reason what I ask actually is if you want to follow up or replicate or develop the topology, it could be easier to know how you have done the literature. So that could be something to think about in the future. My last question, I will give you a choice. You can answer either question number 3 or question number 10. The first, number 3, is about looking into the future. And number 10 is about suggesting 2 research projects. The last questions also include some commercial. So think carefully.
I think I choose number 10, was it? The
number
last
10.
one?
We will turn the page. That was about the mishap, about the research projects. Well, anticipate the future. The first one, the research projects. Okay, in the autumn, next autumn, we will launch a new research school together with Stefan and Johan and Lars and many other colleagues. It's about teacher education and digitalization in schools, in short, upgrade. If you, based on results in your thesis, have to suggest 2 research projects for the new PhD students to conduct, could you explain just in short what you should focus on?
That was a tricky question. Well, I think that you need to think about also, this is for school, not for higher education.
This is basically for higher education and teacher education. So just 2 in short, 2 objects based on your results.
I think the student perspective is very important. How they can use technology and how they perceive the technology that the teachers use and how that could be improved in different ways. That is something that I always think that we benefit a lot if we put ourselves on the other side of the table, so to say, that we put ourselves in the student's position and try to look upon our planning, our design, everything we use in a course from the perspective of the student. And that is something that I have learned as a very active distance student myself, that is very good in all education and pedagogical circumstances. The other one I think is how, I think this about production, that production of material and course content. I think that I think it would be very interesting to emphasize on that.
Okay, thank you. Did you take the notes, Johan?
Thank you very much. So finally, it's time for questions from you. And given that I know that Lena also understands Swedish, I'm going to allow questions in Swedish if you're feeling more comfortable asking them in Swedish. So please.
Okay, thanks. Do you hear me? Yeah. I think I'll take it in English, if that's okay. So I was interested in one of the issues that Stefan brought forward about the videos, or your definition to your choice to define video as something specific and not everything. So I was just curious, was that definition communicated to in the survey or to the teachers? Was that like a definition that the teachers could relate to? Or is that a definition that you just came up with based on previous research?
The question in the survey, it was I defined those 6 categories of video because that was the most important. To define video in general wasn't so important for the respondents because they were only going to answer questions about one category of video at a time. So that was really important. And what was difficult, as I believe, was to show the distinction between video conferencing and desktop conferencing, because that is often mixed up. So in that case, I used a picture for each of them, so that it would be hopefully clearer. There is always a difficult balance, because you can't really have too many explanations and a lot of text for the respondents, because they won't read it or they will leave the survey without answering it. But it's always, of course, very important that they know what category of video they are answering questions about. But I didn't have a definition in general for video. That is something that has been developed during the research and the literature study and so on.
So could I just ask you if you could see like a risk in having that narrow definition? Maybe it's based on data or based on research, and at the same time talking about teachers' perspectives, because maybe not the teacher answering those questions, that's maybe not what the teachers are thinking about. Could there be a risk in like defining video and then saying that you're studying teachers' perspectives? I'm just thinking.
No, I don't think so, because in the survey it was very clearly defined those 6 categories. So I think to have a definition of video in general, I think that wouldn't really have helped. So that is how I see it. But of course, everything is possible and everything is a risk. That is always true, but I don't see that there is a high risk of that. Thank you.
Thank you. So who's next? Yeah, Leona.
So just a short question. I'm just a little bit curious about your typology that you had. And you have video as a tool for learning. That's only under the recorded video. And what's the reason behind that?
Why it's only under recorded?
Under recorded and not for the live.
Yeah, that is a category that has been moved, actually, because it was a separate category before. I realized that all the situations that are included in that category, if it was students making a video, then they recorded it. And if it was in professional education, you often record students' actions. It could be for nurses, for doctors, for teachers, and so on. And then you discuss those recordings and their action and what they did and their interaction with students, for instance, or with patients, and so on. And in those situations, you also recorded it in order to be able to discuss it afterwards. So when I thought about all the situations that were included in that category, I couldn't see that it could be live video.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Då ska du få en fråga på svenska, Lena.
Tack, Lars.
Nära munnen, ja. Inom högre utbildning så har vi ju ett antal förhållandevis stabila undervisningsgenrer. Föreläsning, seminarium, laborationer och så vidare. Jag misstänker att jag vet svaret på det här, men är det möjligtvis så att användningen av video speglar precis den här uppdelningen i kvantitet? Jag menar, väldigt mycket undervisning är föreläsningsbaserad. Är det också där video används mest? Eller använder man video för, vilket ju vore spännande, nya sätt att arrangera undervisningen? Kan du se några sådana exempel?
Ja, det ser jag ju i just den här video as a tool for learning. Där ser jag ju att där finns det speciella möjligheter som inte går att genomföra på annat sätt. Och då är det olika undervisningsaktiviteter där som man just har kunnat använda beroende på den kategorin som inte går att göra på annat sätt. Men jag håller ju helt med dig om att de här olika undervisningsmetoderna som vi använder, och jag tror ju också att, det har jag ju inte undersökt eftersom jag inte har gjort en undersökning på senare tid, men jag hör ju runt omkring att det här med inspelade föreläsningar är någonting som ökar väldigt markant. Samtidigt som vi kanske också börjar fundera över på om det är bästa sättet att undervisa. Men det blir på något annat sätt. Det blir på något annat sätt bättre om det är på video. Lite oklart varför. Men man kan ju dra en parallell med utvecklingen i skolan. När jag började undervisa då var det ganska populärt med sådana här självrättande tester. Det var ju på papper då. Sen började man ifrågasätta det och fundera på vilken typ av kunskap man kunde pröva på det sättet. Och kom fram till att det var en viss typ av kunskap, faktakunskaper och ganska specifik kunskap och sådär. Så då kanske man inte använde det så mycket. Men sen kom ju datorerna in i skolan. Och då kunde man ju ha självrättande tester på skärmen. Och då blev det plötsligt en lysande pedagogik. Fast det egentligen inte var så stor skillnad. Och jag tycker att man kan dra... Jag säger inte att det är fel att föreläsa, för det har absolut sin plats. Och jag säger inte att det är fel att spela in föreläsning heller. Och det blir bättre om man spelar in det, för då kan man ju i alla fall titta på det flera gånger och man kan välja vissa sekvenser. Vilket är en väldig fördel. Men sen kanske vi ska fundera på vilken typ av undervisning som passar bäst i olika situationer. Och att man kanske också har i vissa situationer kanske studentaktiva arbetssätt är mera användbart. Men det är ju väldigt beroende på ämne och vad studenterna ska lära sig och alltihopa det här och vilken studentgrupp man har. Och det är inte så lätt med studentaktiviteter när man, som jag undervisade i pedagogik på personalvetarprogrammet och hade över 100 studenter i en föreläsningssal. Det blir vissa saker man kan göra, men det blir lite begränsat. Är du nöjd med svaret? Tack.
Okay, great. We are getting started with the questions. So who's next? Here we go.
English or Swinglish or Finnish maybe? No, I don't know.
That's up to you, but Finnish no, please.
Yeah, I was thinking, what important improvements in the working environment for teachers have you thought about when you've done your study?
Well, I have been surprised that the teachers have not been involved more in discussions of how this environment could be improved and could be developed. As I interpret it from the interviews at Karlstad University, they have been put into a situation without not really being able to make improvements in it. For instance, there were teachers talking about that they wanted to have the whiteboard back that they used before and they couldn't use when I interviewed them, because they liked be standing in front of the whiteboard and explaining and drawing things and writing things, but that possibility has been removed. Instead, they had a very small whiteboard, and that also made it a bit challenging because they have to structure what they were writing very hard, because otherwise it wasn't room enough for what they were going to write. So I think I would really like to see a dialogue between the teachers who are going to use those environments, teaching environments, and those who are coming with equipment.
Thank you.
Hej Lena, tack för en jätteintressant diskussion. Jag tar mitt också på svenska och jag vill koppla lite till Lars fråga där han ser hur man kan kategorisera undervisning i olika typer av aktiviteter. Och jag tänker, du har pratat väldigt mycket om undervisning, hur man undervisar om ett ämne och studenters lärande och förståelse om ett specifikt ämne. Men i en kurs så är ju mycket av lärarens arbete också att ge feedback och bedömning. Och där var jag lite nyfiken nu när ni frågar, har du sett exempel på i ditt material där man använder video på nya sätt för att ge feedback och bedömning av studenters arbete till skillnad mot textbaserad bedömning och feedback?
Ja, det är också en sak som jag var lite förvånad över, att videoåterkoppling användes väldigt lite. Men jag tror att det kan ha att göra med att nationella studier gjordes 2009. Jag tror att det har kommit mycket på senare tid faktiskt. Men det finns ju studier i min litteraturöversikt som visar att lärare uppfattar att det tar mindre tid och att studenterna tar åt sig återkopplingen via video mycket bättre. Och att de tycker att den blir mer personlig. Och det är ju också en av de här... Den skulle jag lägga in i en av de här inspelade undervisningssituationer i den kategorin. För det är en undervisningssituation när vi ger en återkoppling som lärare. Så att det tror jag. Jag var också förvånad över att det var väldigt lite handledning till exempel. Det var jag också förvånad över. Jag var också förvånad över att man använde inte vare sig desktopkonferens eller videokonferens särskilt mycket för grupparbete. Och jag hade ju alternativ antingen med läraren eller utan läraren, men det var lika magert på båda fronterna så att säga. Videokonferens kan jag kanske förstå, för man måste boka studio och lokaler och det är ett tajt schema och det är inte bara att sätta igång liksom. Men desktopkonferens är ju ett annat läge där studenterna själva kan skapa ett rum och sätta igång. Och jag tror att det har nog säkert ökat om man skulle göra den studien idag. Nu med Zoom så blir det ju helt annorlunda när studenterna har så stora möjligheter att skapa egna rum. Men det har inte riktigt varit så med Adobe Connect. Och det hade ju inte riktigt kommit igång då heller.
More questions? No? Okay. So this concludes then the public part of the defense. So now the committee will meet for some time. There's no real limit to that discussion. But those of you that want to stay here and wait for the result, as I mentioned before, there will be snacks and something to drink on the 3rd floor. And if you are not used to finding your way around this building, just tag along with someone that seems like they know where they are going, so then you will be taken to the right spot. Thank you, everyone.